right, well, welcome everybody. Good evening. Yeah, it's okay. You can clap. It's fine. So, we are very happy that you have chosen to take time out of your Thursday evening to join us today. Thank you. I know there's a lot that you could be doing, but you have chosen to be here, and we appreciate that. My name is Sherwin Williamson. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the Louisiana Tech chapter of Ratio Christi. If you don't know anything about Ratio Christi, we are Latin for Reason of Christ. We are a Christian apologetics ministry. Recently started a chapter this past October here on Tech campus. Ratio Christi has over 200 chapters in the United States and abroad, and we seek to bring thoughtful Christianity to the campus by offering a reasoned defense of the faith, by demonstrating the rationality of the Christian faith, and by providing a place where anyone can ask and discuss any question about the faith, all as we seek to change lives on campus today, and by so doing, change culture tomorrow. That is the purpose of our organization, and that should be the purpose of the university as well. A place where ideas, even those that you disagree with, can be exchanged in a civil manner, and that is our goal for this evening. If you'd like to learn more about Ratio Christi, how you can get involved with our chapter here on Tech, how you can support that chapter if you would like, or how we can partner with you if you are a member of a local church, how we can be a resource to your church. See anybody with a name tag, they should be set up at the table in the back, or you can see myself during one of the breaks or after the seminar, and I will be more than happy to have that discussion with you. You can also follow us on Instagram at Ratio Christi LaTech, or you can visit www.ratiochristi.org. You can find out about our organization there, as well as a lot of free apologetic resources. As far as some housekeeping announcements, if you need the restroom, if you will go out the doors to your back, there are restrooms in the lobby. We also ask that you have no food or drink in this area per university policy. Which brings me now to the purpose of our event. We are pleased to bring you this evening's seminar, Understanding Transgenderism, a Christian Perspective. This is such an important and culturally relevant topic, and one in which much civil discourse is needed. So to that end, we ask that you be respectful of our speaker, we ask that you be respectful of those in attendance, and we ask that you be respectful of yourself and the university as well. Don't cause any interruptions, please. Keep noise to a minimum so that people can hear. There are some of you tonight that will hear things that you agree with, and there are some of you that will hear things that maybe you don't agree with. That's fine. It's good for us to have our ideologies challenged, and it's good for us to have conversations about those challenges. As far as the way the evening will take place, we will have 2 speaking sessions, each lasting approximately 40 to 45 minutes. Each session will be followed by a 10-minute break, and then we will finish with an approximate 30-minute Q&A. If you would like to submit questions for the Q&A, those must be submitted in advance. If you will see, again, someone with a name tag, the back table, or during the breaks, there will be people along the midsection of the auditorium here. They have note cards as well as a QR code that you can scan to submit those questions. Submission of a question does not guarantee that that question will be asked, but we will try to get through as many as possible. And that now brings us to the introduction of our speaker this evening. Tonight, we have the privilege of hearing from Mr. Alex Ray on this important topic of the Christian perspective of transgenderism. Alex comes to us from Gonzales, Louisiana, where he and Hannah, his wife of 8 years, are raising their 2 children, Carter and Addison, ages 4 and 3 respectively. Alex earned his Master of Arts in Theology from the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. I'm also an alumni of there, so a little biased. It's probably the best out of all the seminaries. And he is currently pursuing his PhD in the philosophy of religion from the same seminary. He has served on staff of First Baptist Church Gonzales since 2016, where he is currently serving as the student minister. So without further ado, let's welcome Mr. Alex Ray to begin our evening. Alex.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be with you here this evening. We have quite a lot of material to cover. I'm thankful for Sherwin and for Nate for the invitation, for Ratio Christi for hosting this. What a wonderful organization, and what a wonderful event for us to be able to walk through and talk through a very important subject. And so I'm hopeful that we will have a productive conversation tonight. And you'll have your outline with you, and you can follow along with us as we kind of walk through that. But as we walk through this conversation tonight, I want to be very clear what my intentions are. My intentions are not to shout. My intentions are not to whip out some placard that I have hiding behind stage and pick it or anything like that. My intentions are to have a healthy and productive, and I hope a biblical conversation about a very important subject. To give you the framework for today, what we're going to be doing is the first session in our time right now is going to be more what I'm kind of calling in the air, looking at the philosophy, the ideology, the thought that goes behind the transgender movement. And then we'll take a break, as Sherwin mentioned, and then when we come back, I want to get more onto the ground and think about what does it look like, real life situation. What do you do when you have a coworker or a brother or a sister or a friend or so on and so forth that's walking through this? How do you engage in that? And so that'll be kind of our agenda for the evening. The first question I wanted to think about is what kind of posture ought we to take when discussing this? And I think, as usual, it's not bad to give the Sunday school answer here, which is Jesus. That when you think about who Jesus was often known as a man of compassion. We see that time and time and time again through Scripture. He was known as a man of compassion. And what's interesting about this word compassion here, it's not just mere, oh, I'm so sorry for you. It's so sad to be you. It's not the kind of compassion that Jesus is being described of here. The Greek word that's being used here for compassion, it literally means to be moved in the bowels. Quite a graphic image there. It is this real hurt and attachment going on there. It's more than just mere lip service. That when Jesus has compassion, it's not just oh, so sorry, and he keeps walking. That he truly has attached himself to the person that he has compassion to. And I think that's the same kind of thing that you and I ought to have as well as we have this kind of conversation. This conversation goes far beyond gender. This conversation goes far beyond sexuality. This conversation, it really goes to what does it mean to be made in the image of God? That's a really important statement. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? And we'll unpack that a little bit as well as we move through tonight. But a really good book, and I have a bad habit of recommending books to people, and I do it maybe a little bit too forcefully sometimes. I'm going to do it anyways right now. There's a really good book I want to encourage you for the readers out here called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And it's written by a guy named Carl Trueman, who's probably in his 40s or 50s or so. And in the opening pages of this book, he talks about how when he thinks about his grandfather, who has since deceased, of course, and he was thinking, if my grandfather, that's how he opened the book, he said, if my grandfather would have heard the statement, I'm a woman trapped in a man body, his grandfather would have not known how to respond to that. Like, he wouldn't have had the vocabulary to make sense of that statement. And so Carl Trueman, he writes this book, and basically the question that he's asking is, how do we get to an age now where not only if I would have stood up here this evening and tell you that I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, not only did that sentence make sense to you, like you get it, like you understand what I'm saying, but you might even agree with it. And so that's a colossal shift in our society. And so basically Trueman expounds this book trying to answer, how do we get to that point? It doesn't happen overnight. Of course, in our society, we're very familiar with Pride 365 every June. We have Pride Month. It's not just one day, it's an entire month dedicated to that. And not only just an entire month, it's also, we see Pride 365. We see it every time you go on Disney. You see any number of places. We see it in sports. We see it in entertainment. It is just everywhere in our face. President Joe Biden has no pun intended, prided himself on having the most, what he would call, diverse cabinet and diverse appointees in American history. There was an article written, I think it was USA Today or Newsweek, and one of those talked about how of the 1,500 or so appointees that he has selected, over 10%, I think about 12 or so percent, are in the LGBTQ movement, so it's around 200 or so or something people. Now, it's easy to look at President Joe Biden and say it's all your fault. But let's play a game. I like games. We have 4 presidents here. The younger, I think even the college freshmen here will recognize all these faces. You have former President George W. Bush, who was president in the early 2000s. We have former President Barack Obama. We have former President Donald Trump. And we have current President Joe Biden, possibly going to be reelected Joe Biden. Now, I want you to think in your mind, which of these presidents was the first president to run on a platform saying, I agree with same-sex marriage? Let me say that again. One of these men was the first president to run on a platform saying that they agreed. They didn't change their mind later. They ran on a platform saying, I agree with the redefinition of marriage. We have George Bush, who was a Republican. We have Barack Obama, who was a Democrat. We have Donald Trump, who was a Republican. And we have, of course, President Joe Biden, who is very much a Democrat. If you think it is George Bush, you would be incorrect. That's an easy one. If you think it was Barack Obama, you would be incorrect. If you think it was Joe Biden, you would also be incorrect. The first president to run on a platform fully endorsing the redefinition of marriage as a one-man and one-woman union for life was former President Donald Trump. This is not a Joe Biden issue. This is not a Democratic problem. This predates Joe Biden. This predates Donald Trump. I'm not even just blaming him. I'm just saying that President Joe Biden is not the boogeyman here. He's not the one that we're going to blame on this. This has been This has been something that's been going on for years and years and years and years, if not literally decades. We see here there's also in our society there's an emphasis to expand Pride Month to Pride Year. And so there's someone I want to introduce you to if you don't know who this is. I'm going to show you a little video. This is Admiral Rachel Levine. Admiral Rachel Levine was appointed by President Joe Biden as the Assistant Secretary of Health. And for our purposes tonight, that's just a very important position. A very important position in the Biden cabinet and American government, making very, very important decisions and significant decisions about health care, not just for adults, but also for children as well. And I want you to notice what Rachel Levine, formerly Richard Levine, this is a biological male who identifies as a woman, was also named as Woman of the Year. Talk more about that later. But I want you to notice what he says about Pride Month. This was recorded last June.
Hello, my name is Admiral Rachel Levine, and I have the honor of being the Assistant Secretary for Health at the United States Department of Health and Human Services. Happy Pride. Happy Pride Month, and actually, let's declare it a summer of pride. Happy Summer of Pride.
So we go from Pride Month to Summer of Pride, and if you're a Disney subscriber, you'll see something like Pride 365 all year. It's in our face, no matter where we see it. What's interesting as well is to see what population and what segment of the population hold to this and advocates for this. How many transgendered people do you think there are? There are over 300 million people in this country. It's a big world. It's a big country. But how many transgendered people do you think there are in our country? The latest number that I've been able to find, according to the Williams Institute, that 1.6 million people over the age of 13 identify as transgender. Now, the interesting thing about this number as well, if you look at the graph, the chart on the right side, you'll notice there that the red bar represent Generation Z, which I would imagine is most people in this room. That's somewhere, it's a little foggy sometimes, but it's somewhere around, if you were born around 1998-ish to like the mid-2000-ish. Those are the people that would be represented as Gen Z. You notice there is quite disproportionate. That the red bar is much higher than certainly the yellow bar, or really all the other ones. Why is that? Is this a brand new thing that's never been thought of in human history? I don't think so. I wonder if there's something more specific going on. The word social contagion is often used to describe this phenomenon, where you have a large swath of people, in this case a Generation Z, so teenagers and young college students usually, and they are disproportionately represented and holding to the LGBTQ movement more so than any other generation. Why is that? And the reason why I'm asking this is because what we're told is usually this is just something that's innate, this is nothing that can't be changed, or something that you're born with. It's no different than your skin color, it's no different than your hair color, whatever happens to be. If that's the case, then why is it that we're not talking about it to this degree until this Generation Z? If it's always been around, then why aren't the boomers dealing with it? I'm a millennial. That wasn't something that we talked about when I was growing up. Why is it primarily Generation Z? It's a question I think we need to wrestle with. But of course, as we have this conversation, we need to understand the terms. It's important to define our terms. That's what I want to do very briefly here. Understanding the terms, there are a couple of terms we want to think about. The first one is sex. Sex refers typically to our genetic makeup. Men have XY chromosomes, while women have XX chromosomes. This is something you'll be taught in every basic biology textbook, whether you're in elementary school or college, I would imagine. Because there are differences between men and women at the genetic level, there are also differences in men and women at the physical level as well. Men typically have deeper voices than women. Typically. Sure, are there exceptions? Sure there are. Men typically have broader shoulders than women. Are there exceptions? Of course there are. I used to have a college student who competed as a swimmer for LSU. She was very broad-shouldered as a swimmer, which makes perfect sense. But usually, more often than not, women are much slimmer than men are. To state the obvious, women can give birth, typically, while men never can. There are differences, there are biological realities that are intrinsically different between the sexes. That's not hate, that's biology. That's what we mean by sex. But of course, what we hear today, you might be familiar with the term or the phrase, sex assigned at birth. And the idea behind this phrase, for people who say it, is that when you are born, there's nothing intrinsically male or female about you. You were born, and the doctor looked at you and decided to assign you a male or assign you as a female, thereby taking that choice away from you. That's the argument that's being promoted. But that's not the case at all. We have gender, and gender is an interesting thing. Gender typically is something that, with the American Psychological Association, define gender as the attitudes, feelings, and behaviors that a given culture associates with a person's biological sex. So sex typically is biology. Gender typically is something that is expressed. Now what's interesting, up until about 10 years ago, those were one and the same and they were synonymous. It's only until recent history that we've separated the two. And the way that we express our gender certainly can change. I want to be clear here. It can change. The way that we express our gender can change from culture to culture. Let me give you an example. A few years ago, before we had children, my wife and I went on a cruise. Highly recommend it if you ever get the chance to do it. We went on a cruise on Carnival, heading out of New Orleans. And something that you do or at least that Carnival did, I don't know if other cruise lines do it, but at least on Carnival, they had a guy who was basically the face of the cruise ship. His name is Chris. And Chris was unforgettable. He called himself Chris the Flying Scotsman, because he was from Scotland. He had a delightful Scottish accent. And he was the one doing the announcement over the intercom. He was the one that any kind of change of plans or whatever, he was the one that you would see. He would do like a little news show every morning that you could watch on your little 3-inch TV in your room. You could see this little news show every morning. He was the guy that you saw. Do you know what Chris the Flying Scotsman wore every single day that I saw him? A different pair of really nice shoes, like high-top Nikes, so kind of jealous. But also, in addition to that, he wore a kilt. Could be from Scotland. Now, if I were to have come to you this evening, and have worn a kilt, clearly I do not have a Scottish accent. You would have probably thought something was a little strange, and you would have been rightfully so. Because here in America, typically men don't wear kilts. But in Scotland, you have Braveheart, and you have Mel Gibson, and they're wearing kilt. That's like the man, you're less of a man if you don't wear a kilt. I don't know how it goes over there, but basically they don't think twice about wearing kilts over there because that's how they express what it means to be a man. But here it's a little bit different. So the way that you express your gender certainly can change from place to place, but it doesn't mean that you're a different sex entirely. The third one here, gender identity. And this is a new term. This is a new one that's brought in. It's new, comparatively speaking. Came out in the early to mid 20th century, really mid 20th century. And this was a guy named John Money. John Money is quite a rabbit hole I would encourage you to check out, but John Money is reputed to be the one who had invented this term. There's a little bit of controversy about that. It might have predated him. But he certainly is the one who popularized it. And he was a man who basically was a scientist, and I use that word loosely, who made a bunch of fraudulent research results. I would encourage you to check him out. It's quite a horror story. But he's very influential, and a lot of his teachings, a lot of his quote-unquote findings, very much spearheaded a lot of what we see today. A lot of stuff that we see today very much begins, in some respect, to what John Money promoted. But this idea of gender identity, this thing is that you don't have an innate sex or an innate gender. Your gender identity is exactly what it says. You identify as a gender in this movement, in this ideology. And because you identify as that gender, that means you are that gender. You are that gender according to that. But again, this isn't intrinsically new. A very influential philosopher in the mid-20th century said this: one is not born, but rather becomes woman. The female is a woman insofar as she feels herself as such. Nature does not define woman. It is she who defines herself by reclaiming nature for herself in her affectivity. Affectivity meaning mind and emotion. So Simone de Beauvoir, very influential French philosopher and thinker, is saying what you want to be is what you are. What you identify is what you are. So if you're a biological male, it doesn't matter. What matters is, according to this, it's what you identify as. Gender identity. This is why when my wife was pregnant with my daughter, and she went in for one of her routine checkups at a hospital just outside in the Baton Rouge area. And whenever you go in for your routine checkup, they ask you, how you're feeling, that sort of thing. And one of the questions they asked my wife was, do you feel like a woman today? And they weren't joking. Do you feel like a woman today? And my wife said, yeah. Gender dysphoria is the next term here, and this is a real medical issue. This is when someone feels that their gender identity doesn't match with their biological sex. And so for some people, what they identify as, they might see themselves, they might look in the mirror and they see male parts, male anatomy, but it doesn't match with what they have in their mind. And for some people, this is a legitimate diagnosed condition. And the dysphoria, what that means, there's an angst about it. And so for some people, this is awful. I myself have never dealt with it, but for the people who truly struggle with it, I can only imagine this is absolutely heartbreaking. To look at yourself in the mirror and not be able to see yourself for who you are, but think that you ought to be different. And every moment of every day, that's something that you're wrestling with. I can't imagine that kind of nightmare. But for some people, that really is a thing. And that's why we need to remember that every person had a story. Every person has a story. That's why we need to have compassion. So that when we're talking with someone who is promoting this, whether it's on campus, whether it's over dinner, whatever it happens to be, assume the best. Everybody has their story, hear it out, and see what they have to say. This is a genuine experience. They feel that their body is lying to them. And so because they feel that their body is lying to them, sometimes they feel that medical intervention is necessary. So they'll do something that's called top surgery. If they're a female, they'll do what's called top surgery, which is basically a mastectomy, where you remove healthy breasts. Sometimes they'll do what's called a bottom surgery, and let your imagination go there. And what they're doing is they're taking this picture they have in their mind of what a female looks like. They have a picture in their mind of what a male looks like, and they want to undergo radical surgery to make their mind match their body, or rather the other way around, make their body match their mind. Then we have the last one, transgender, which is just an umbrella term for the state of someone who's identifying as a different gender than what they truly are, doesn't match their biological sex. And then, of course, within that, there's subcategories of this. So within transgender, you have cisgender, which is someone, this is how it's defined in the movement. A cisgender person would be someone whose biological identity or biological sex actually does line up with what they think. That's what it's called, cisgender. That's what they call it. A trans man is a biological woman who identifies as a man, and a trans woman is identified as someone who is a biological male but identified as a woman. But here's a really interesting question. If you ever talk to somebody about this, chances are they're going to bring this one up. What about the intersex? And intersex, that's a great question. It's a wonderful conversation to have. Because what intersex is, and Nancy Pearcey, who's a wonderful communicator about this stuff, she came out with a really helpful definition that I really couldn't quite improve. Nancy Pearcey shared how intersex is where a very small percentage of people are born with genitals that are ambiguous or not fully formed due to genetic and hormonal abnormalities. As a result, doctors may not be sure what the newborn's sex is. The standard treatment was to, quote, assign a sex and administer hormones and plastic surgery to bring the child in line with gender expectation. This was a very small minority. But the main point behind this is, number one, it doesn't, because the existence of intersex, it does exist, but it doesn't support the idea that there's this entirely separate, that non-binary actually exists. It doesn't give any kind of support for that. But ultimately, and I think this is well said, Andrew Walker said it this way, intersex is a physical condition, which it very much is, whereas transgender is a psychological condition. Intersex is a physical condition, while transgender is a psychological condition. Now, what does LGBTQ, we'll add the IA, plus stand for? Can you say all the letters in your mind right now? You'll notice the plus is there for a reason. The plus is there because there really is no ending point. Here's one way to define this. By the way, the answer to that would be lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer/questioning, intersex, and asexual. Is the A. Asexual means that you don't have any attraction to anybody at all. But here's some more. That it's expanded here. We have ally up top. Ally is someone who supports the movement, but doesn't necessarily identify the member inside of it, which, by the way, is a really clever marketing move. Because to be classified as an ally, you don't have to be transgendered yourself. You should need to be an advocate of it. You need to be in support of it. and then you can be part of the movement. That's one of the A's in the plus. We have pansexual, with sexual attraction for all genders. So Demi Lovato, very influential entertainer, is someone who came out over the last couple of years, said that she was pansexual, because that's something that we need to announce. Androgynous is someone that has both male and female traits. Genderqueer, two-spirit. Two-spirit is another interesting one. It means that it's typically used by Native Americans to describe a third gender. And what I find interesting about this one is that we live in a very secular age and a very post-Christian age that very much rejects the idea of any kind of supernatural world at all. That's so backward. You believe in spirits and you believe in angels? How could you possibly do that in the 21st century? So we live in an age that very much rejects any kind of spiritual world, but we do believe in two-spirit. We do believe in two spirits. Demisexual describes someone that requires an emotional bond to form a sexual attraction. Let me say that again. What is now included in the plus is demisexual. Demisexual is someone that requires an emotional bond to form a sexual attraction. You know what that used to be called? Dating. Dating, that's what it was called. You dated somebody, you became attracted to them, and then you proposed to them and you got married. But we put a new label on it. Polyamorous, someone who has multiple relationships at the same time, so on and so forth. But here's what's interesting as well, on the very bottom of it, if you can read it, at the very bottom of it, it says that new term can be added at any time, because the plus doesn't have an endpoint. So here's what we covered. We have transgender, so really everything covered in this. Transgender is someone who we identify as, something we identify as. We have intersex, which is biology. We have pansexual, something I'm attracted about. So identity, biology, attraction. We have ally, someone who's just supportive. We're covering all the bases. And so here's what's interesting. In the journey to reject any idea of a binary, a new binary had been constructed. One camp is the LGBTQ+, one camp is everything else. You're either in or you're out. It's a rejection of one binary in favor of another one. So how are we to understand this? I think one way we can understand this is to say that there are two moves being made here. There are two moves being made here. That the first move is that there's a rejection of one thing, and the second move is that there's an acceptance of something else. The rejection of objective truth is the first thing. And really here is just one word for this, is postmodernism. Postmodernism is just really the air that we breathe. My first time on campus, but I suspect that this is very much the air that is breathed here, if it's like any other college campus. That postmodernism is the rejection of the idea there's any kind of objective truth that exists. And so maybe you've heard it this way in your exchanges and your conversations. Maybe you hear something like, you live your truth and I'll live my truth. Or maybe it's something like, that's true for you, but what's true for you is true for you, what's true for me is true for me. Something along that line. That's postmodernism. That's the idea that the rejection of any kind of objective truth about the world, what matters is what you think in your mind. And your opinion is just as the same and just as valid and just as correct as any other opinion. There are two ways of looking at the world. And I want to encourage you and suggest that if you catch nothing else, I want to encourage you to take this to heart. I think this is one of the most important distinctions that we need to know here tonight. There are two ways of understanding the world. We call it the puzzle box and the sandbox. The puzzle box is this idea that there's an objective reality to how life ought to be lived. So if you were to do a jigsaw puzzle, maybe you take all the pieces out, you hope all the pieces are all there, you put them on your table, you mix them up, and if you're like me and you want a shortcut, I'll put the box up there I don't think it's cheating, it's just part of putting the puzzle together, right? So you have the reference picture, and it tells you what the puzzle's supposed to look like. And you use that to put the puzzle together. That mimesis, the word that's used there, what it means, that there's an objective reality to what the world ought to be like, how we ought to live. There's a given structure, a teleology might be a word you might use there. There's a given nature to the order of things. And you and I are called to live in accordance with that nature. That's the puzzle box. The other way to look at that is the sandbox. And the word that's used here is poiesis, and it's actually the same Greek word as poetry. And what is poetry? Poetry, you're creating something. You're using language to create artificial world and create beautiful sentences that evoke meaning and all sorts of things, to drive at the emotion. You're creating something. That's what's being used here. The sandbox, what do you do in a sandbox? What do you do at the beach? If you're a child, you make sandcastles. If you're a 5-year-old boy, you dig a hole. If you're a 35-year-old boy, you still dig a hole. There's something about digging holes at the beach that we like doing. It never gets old. But that's what you do, right? You take that and you make something out of it. You make a world out of it. And so the question here for us is, what kind of world are we living in? Are we living in a world where there's a given order to things, a given structure to reality that you and I are called to live in accordance with? Or is the world basically just a collection of atoms of just raw stuff, raw material, and we're supposed to we can create whatever we want out of it? I would submit to you that the transgender movement is the latter. What is the transgender movement but the rejection of objective truth and taking raw matter, us, and trying to create something new out of it? That's exactly what it is. There was a very influential thinker back in the day, and she's still alive, Camille Paglia, who herself is a lesbian, and I mention that because that's the context of this quote. She's writing the passage about defending her lesbianism, but it very much applied to what we're talking about here. But in the context of this quote that we're about to read, what she's saying here is that nature has basically unfairly imposed herself, like the reality, onto her. And so she feels that we are obligated to buck against nature and do whatever we want. In her case, she's rejecting traditional sexual mores and saying, I'm going to engage in a particular sexual ethic that I think is right. Here's what she said. We not only have the right, but the obligation, that's an interesting word there, to defy nature's tyranny. The highest human identity consists precisely in such assertion of freedom against material limitation. Fate, not God, has given us this flesh. We have absolute claim to our bodies and may do with them as we see fit. That's quite telling. And so in this idea, it's just up to you and I to do whatever we want with our body. Nobody can tell us what to do or what not to do. Nobody can tell us that what we're doing is wrong. It is merely up to us. This is why you'll hear things in today's society, such as men can get pregnant. Because again, in this movement, there is no such thing as man, objectively speaking. Which is why my wife would ask if she felt like a woman. Because if my wife had said no, she didn't, but let's imagine she did, then the nurse or whoever it was that asked her that question would have moved forward saying, okay, I have a pregnant male in front of me. Before we have Healthline, I want you to notice the date on that. Again, it's not a new thing. In 2018, came out with a whole article. Is it possible for men to become pregnant? That's the question that's being asked there. And the first line said, yes. It's possible for men to become pregnant and have children of their own. In fact, it's probably a lot more common than you might think. So here's my question whenever I'm having these conversations with people. I think conversations are important. And I think we should ask questions. Again, we're not looking to bash anybody. We're not looking to smack anybody over the head. We want to have conversations. Good faith, well-intentioned conversation. And one of the questions that I look to bring up whenever I'm given the opportunity is, okay, let's imagine you're right. Let's imagine is completely legitimate and completely sound. Let's grant that for the sake of argument, okay? Does the modifier trans, talk about transgender, can I use that trans for anything else? So for example, can I say that I'm transracial or trans age? And if not, why not? Can I identify as a black man right now? I'm half Jewish. I couldn't be further away from that. But could I do it? Why not? I'm 35 years old. Could I identify as a 15-year-old? Or a 5-year-old for that matter? And be my son's classmate next year? Why not? There are examples of this. A couple years ago, Rachel Dolezal came out around the same time as Caitlyn Jenner, actually, in 2018, 2019 or so. And Rachel Dolezal was a black rights activist. She was not only was she involved with the NAACP, she was a chapter president of the NAACP, or excuse me, a branch president of the NAACP. She wasn't just an activist, she was very, very involved. And it came out later that not only was she not African American, she was very, very Caucasian. This is her. She put toner on, did her hair differently, and she passed herself off as African American. She identified as African American. She was the branch president of the NAACP. And there was this huge uproar about it. How dare you do that? But wait a second, why couldn't trans also apply to race? How about age? Oh, by the way, here's one more example. Ollie London, who was a performer and an entertainer over in Europe, and he himself saw himself as born in the wrong body. And he had a lot of money for some reason. I think he was some sort of celebrity or something like that. And so he underwent massive surgery, cosmetic surgery, to look Korean. There was a K-pop band that he liked. And there's one particular person in the K-pop band that he liked that he wanted to look like. And so he had massive amounts of surgery to look like this Asian person. And he said, hey, listen, I was born in the wrong body. How about trans age? This is a real person named Stephanie Walsh. Stephanie Walsh in the top right was the same person all throughout, but in the top right, he was married to a woman for 23 years. He had 7 children. And at some point in his marriage, he decided that he wanted to identify not just as a different age, but as a girl, a small child. He left his family, identified as a 6-year-old girl, deserted his wife and 7 kids, identified as a 6-year-old girl, and found an elderly couple to adopt him. Why not? Why couldn't trans also apply to that? I mean, after all, we have scientific journals arguing for the legal age change. Maybe if you're on TikTok, maybe you've seen this person before. This is Dylan Mulvaney, if you're not familiar with who this person is. Dylan Mulvaney was a young man who had somewhat of a career in, I think, Broadway or something like that. And about a year and a half ago, he decided that he wanted to identify as a female. And so he started this thing on TikTok and Instagram, Snapchat, and all that, where every day he chronicled his life as a female. 365 days of what? You remember? Girlhood. Not just womanhood, but girlhood. 365 days of girlhood. Not just a woman, but a small child, which is why, and you see a lot of his videos, he acts like a teenage girl. Or at least did. I don't know if he's still doing that anymore, but he did. He got pigtails, he twirled around in dresses in his room, and he's giddy, and it's just... And this man had a sit-down interview with the president. Girlhood. Not only did he do that, but he would also call the Woman of the Year by Attitude Magazine, with the picture on the right. Woman of the Year. Personally, if I were going to make an argument for something, I personally think, I don't think it takes much, I think I could make a stronger case for trans age than transgender. I think if you put me to it, I think I could. After all, haven't we had different calendars throughout world history? I don't think it'd be much of a stretch. Whenever I think about this, I constantly come back to Psalm chapter 2. And in Psalm chapter 2, we see this really sobering psalm where we see that it's about those who are rebelling against God and His created order. And verse 3, I think, is the most telling, that the kingdom of this world, the kingdom of this earth have rejected God's order. And verse 3 said, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. Which is to say, they're saying, we see reality, we don't like it. We see how God made things, we don't like it. We want nothing to do with it. We want to do things our own way. This psalm was written thousands of years ago, and the mentality is still very much the same. How is language affected? For example, what should you and I call women? Just to take one example. I have a running list of ones that I've heard over the last couple of years. I've heard women, I'm not making this up, I have heard women referred to as birthing people and egg producers, among many others. Birthing people, people who can give birth, people who can menstruate, egg producers, people who can produce eggs, so on and so forth, all other sorts of flavors. Not just women, which is why in a number of high schools, certainly across the country, and I think colleges as well, maybe it happens here, I don't know, but in men's restrooms, they will have tampons. So a tampon machine in men's restroom, because in this ideology, men can have periods. You'll notice that the video that I showed you a little while ago of Rachel Levine, formerly Richard Levine. Rachel did legally change names, so I'll refer to him as such. But when he was announced as the first four-star admiral in the U.S. Public Health Service, notice what word was used here. It wasn't transgender at first. Well, they used both, but they also used what? Female. He's not only the first transgender, he's also the first female. The word is being used synonymously. So we have a rejection of objective truth, and we have an acceptance of something else. And the acceptance of something else is what we might call expressive individualism. And the idea behind this is that what matters most in life is that you need to do what's true to you. By the way, Rachel Levine, when he was named Woman of the Year, do you know what his they asked him? They said, if you could tell one thing to the women of society, what would you say? You know what it was? Be true to yourself. Be true to yourself. That was his parting words. Which is very much in line with the air that we breathe. It's very much in line with Elsa from Frozen, very popular song, right? Time to see what I can do, to test the limits and break through, no right, no wrong, no rule for me, I'm free. This idea here being, I'm not knocking Frozen. My wife and my daughter were just watching it the other night. I'm not knocking the movie. I'm just saying this is the air that we breathe. That what matters most in life is that you do what feels true to you, forget what anybody else says. What matters most is how you feel on the inside. That's what matters most. That's your North Star. That's what's guiding you in life. Which is why Caitlyn Jenner, formerly known as Bruce Jenner, your parents will certainly know who he was back in the 70s. He was just an incredible American athlete, won Olympic gold medals, was on the Wheaties boxes, so on and so forth. He was just the man's man. He was the face of America. He was like Captain America. And then in the mid to late 2000s, he came out as transgender, and he wrote a very sobering book called Secrets of My Life, I believe what the title of it was. I would encourage you to read it. Very hard to read. Very difficult. Because basically what he says is he talks about how he claimed to be struggling with it throughout his entire life. Matter of fact, he said that when he was in the Olympics back in the 70s, he would go back to his hotel at night and wear women's underwear. And the next day he crushed the decathlon, whatever it was that he was competing in. But he said he'd been struggling for years. But in his book, this is what he says. He said, "I've written this book to help us see that there is no right way to be or wrong way to be or any way to be except who you are." This was in 2017 he wrote this. Now that's a really interesting statement. There's no wrong way to be or right way to be except who you are. Let's compare two people. We have girl number one. Girl number one looks at herself in the mirror and doesn't like what she sees. I would imagine every girl in this room had to identify with that at some point in their life, maybe even tonight before they came here. They look in the mirror, they don't like what they see. Not only do they not like what they see, maybe they're in deep anguish over it. Maybe they're in so much deep anguish over it that she undergoes extreme radical action to reshape her body. Let's imagine we have girl number two. Girl number two also looks in the mirror, doesn't like what she sees. She doesn't like what she sees so much that each day she has the angst and the despair over her, where she gets increasingly more depressed and anxious and perhaps even suicidal, because what she sees in the mirror is not what matches in her mind. And so she also undergoes radical action to make her body fit her mind. This girl is not transgender, but bulimic. The first girl undergoes surgery and amputates what are otherwise completely perfect and healthy breasts and chops them off to make them fit what she thinks what a boy looks like. The second girl is bulimic, and so instead of undergoing surgery, she just sticks her finger in her throat every time she eats a meal. What's the difference? What's the difference? There's really no right or wrong way to be who you are, really? What about the children? We see again this movement, just propagandized to children at this point. We see it everywhere. Disney, ESPN, Cartoon Network, parents in the room. Do you know what your children are watching? Snapchat, TikTok, Instagram, whatever it is. Do you know YouTube? Do you know what your children are watching? You should. You're paying their cell phone bill, and you're their parent. Forget the cell phone. You're their parent. You ought to know. Again, Rachel Levine, in a recent interview, he would ask in an interview, this was last summer, I believe, and he was asked by the interviewer, I think it was ABC, and the interviewer said, "Why not just let the kids wait?" Perfectly reasonable question. Why not let the kids wait? Wait till they get to 18, and then if they want to have surgery or do hormone pill, whatever, then let them do that. A perfectly reasonable question. And Levine said, puberty is hard, but what if you're going through the wrong puberty? What if inside you feel that you are female, but now you're going through a male puberty? You know what that is? That's poison. There is nothing wrong with your body. You are made in the image of God. You're not an accident. You're not here by chance. You're created by a good God who is loving and gracious. There is no such thing as a wrong puberty. Puberty is hard, yes, for sure. I don't miss those pimples. But there's no such thing as a wrong puberty. We also see it marketed in kids, again, in school. This is how they teach this stuff to kids. We have the genderbread person. This had gone through a number of revisions over the years. The original version is the one on the left. The latest one is version 4 is on the right. This is how they teach it. They differentiate between sex and gender identity and expression and so on and so forth. Cartoon Network again. And then we have a large number of, particularly girls, not just young boys, but mainly girls, teenage girls, Gen Z girls, who are undergoing radical surgery, to the point where a journalist named Abigail Schreier saw a need to write a book about it. I'll encourage you to check that out. The question for us, is surgery necessary? That's the question I would ask to everybody, really. Is surgery really necessary? Or maybe just wait. Well, I think Jenner helps out here again. Says this, you said, what's interesting is he kind of talked out of both sides of his mouth. He said you don't have to do a single thing physically to be a trans man or a trans woman. There's no rule book. But just a couple pages later, the same book, a handful or so pages later, he says, for me, and speaking only for me, the feeling is if I'm going to do it, then I might as well do it. I will never feel like a woman if I don't have the surgery. Well, which one is it? It's either necessary or it's not. They're either in the playbook or there's not. Is it necessary? It doesn't seem to be. We have Jazz Jennings, who spent most of his life on camera. He had a show called I Am Jazz. Came out the book a couple years ago, also very, very sobering and difficult to read. Jazz Jennings, the biological male, identifies as a female. And what's probably the most heartbreaking part about Jazz Jennings, one of the most heartbreaking parts about Jazz Jennings, is that he was put on puberty blockers at such a young age that his body did not develop enough to be able to have what is called gender-confirming surgery. That's what it's called now. And without getting too graphic, what that means is that for a male to become a woman, to transition as a woman, what they do is they take the tissue, they amputate the penis. And they use the tissue of the penis to create an artificial vagina. But because he started on puberty blockers at such a young age, and he was very young, his body did not develop enough to have enough tissue to use, so they had to take skin from other parts of his body. That's what he's talking about here. The complications were severe. That's part of it. The other part of the reason why it's severe is because it's literally an open wound. That's literally what it is. And so what happens is, if you've had a cut before, what happens when you get a cut? Your body heals, right? Well, that's what the wound wants to do. The wound wants to naturally heal and close up. And so what they have to do is they have to prevent it from closing. Let's put it that way. That's the difficulty that he's talking about here. By the way, this article, if you can't see it, was Women's Health. But this is what he says here. He said, this is the article. There was just an unfortunate event and the setback where things did come apart, and there was a complication. I had to come back in for another procedure, but it was all just part of the journey. The good thing is, though, that it was only cosmetic and external, so it wasn't too dramatic. Notice here, he kind of let the cat out of the bag here. Notice how he said it's only cosmetic, because it is. Because you can't change your sex. No matter what surgery you do, you cannot change your sex. It's only cosmetic. Now, the other way around, when you have a biological woman who wants to quote-unquote transition to a man, what they do is called a phalloplasty. And typically what that involves is taking skin, usually from the arm, sometimes from the thigh. But what they'll do is they'll take that that skin, and they will construct an artificial penis out of that skin, and they'll take it from the arm. Here's a video of a woman who did this. This is 2 years removed. And this woman is proud of the scar that she has. In this video, she's saying, look how amazing this looks. Look how well it's healed. Isn't this incredible? Look at technology. Look at medicine. What a world we live in. In this whole video, she's saying, I'm 2 years post-op. This is amazing. Is surgery even necessary? Again, Jenner said, no. This is why, if you remember, Jenner was awarded Woman of the Year by ESPN when he first came out. And what's interesting, and talked about this in the book as well, he didn't have what he called the final surgery. He didn't have that until later on. So he would call Woman of the Year while having all the male appendages. But again, you can't change your sex. To close our first session, I want to leave us with 2 verses. At the end of the day, and we'll talk more about this in the next session, but at the end of the day, what's the job? Our job is to point people to the goodness of God's creation. About a year or so ago, over the last year or so ago, I had a student who was in middle school, a young lady who had totally bought into this ideology. She wanted to be called a male name. She wore baggy clothes. Everything you could think of, she was doing. She was being called, everything you did, she can do. That's what she was doing, excuse me. And we met with her. We prayed for her. As a staff, we prayed for her. Parents, wonderful parents, praying for her. And she was just totally bought in to this ideology. And what's amazing is several months later, God absolutely rocked her world. And she came to see that she was not an accident, that there was nothing wrong with her body. And she's meeting with some of the ladies in our church. We just absolutely love this young lady. And we're meeting with her, we're praying with her, we're talking with her. A number of people. She's a full-fledged church. We love you, we want to see you thrive. And what's amazing is, a couple months later, she came to saving faith in Christ. And when we baptized her, the way we do baptisms at our church is you write your testimony beforehand, and you get to share it from the baptistry. It's incredible. I love it. And she had a sheet of paper, and she wrote her testimony about how she met with Miss Stephanie and who talked to her parents, this and that. And the 2 verses that stuck out to her were these verses on the screen. The 2 verses that stuck out to her that led her to understand what it meant that she was made in the image of God, that there was a Savior who loved her. These are the 2 verses that spearheaded that. Psalm 139, verse 14. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. That is good news. If you're struggling tonight with this, know that you are fearfully and wonderfully made. And then in Genesis chapter 1, we see God created man in his own image. That is the good news of creation. And what I want to do in our next session is to unpack what does that look like on the ground? What does that look like when we have coworkers and friends and daughters and whatever it happens to be? What does it look like to actually have this conversation with them? But the main thing right now is that you and I, don't get in an argument, point them to the goodness of God's creation. That's what they need to hear first. Let's pray together. Father, I thank you for these men and women. I thank you for the privilege to be able to walk through this first session and talk about what it means to be made in the image of God. We thank you for the saving power of the gospel. We thank you that we are fearfully and wonderfully made in your image. And I pray, Father, that as we have people in our lives that we're talking to, you would help us to point them to your goodness, to that we're to give an order to things, to give a nature to things, to give a structure to things, and that's what leads to life, not despair. Give it a heart for others, a heart of compassion, and may we point them to you. In Jesus' name, amen.
All right, that concludes session 1. I have 6:37. Let's take about a 13-minute or so break. We will convene back at 6:50 for the beginning of session 2. Let me encourage you, take this time, have conversation among yourself, use the restroom if you need, but also visit our table out front. I don't know how much literature is left, but we do have some free literature to give out. We have this book, The Bible and Same-Sex Relationships. This is something that is actually produced by Ratio Christi. If you'd like to know more about our publications, we have about 33 little booklets like this on various topics, from critical theory to does God exist, historical evidence of the resurrection, and so on. And then we also have this little book here, What Does the Bible Teach About Transgenderism, written by Dr. Owen Strahan and Gavin Peacock. Excellent little book. If we have any more copies of these are free. Just see someone with a name tag out at the back table. So with that being said, you are on break, and we will come back at 6:50.